This is augforums.com Real Talk, an unfiltered, independent perspective on Acumatica Cloud ERP. My name is Tim Rodman, and I want to mention three things in this pre-recorded intro before we get started. First, thank you to our sponsors. Our first sponsor is Paya. Paya offers Acumatica users a suite of industry-leading payment orchestration tools. Far beyond native Acumatica payments, Paya enables EMV, NFC terminals for counter sale. They offer a frictionless customer portal through their click-to-pay solution, and they support most e-commerce platforms and point-of-sale solutions used with Acumatica, such as One Retail and AcuPOS. And best of all, omni-channel reconciliation is available for all of their solutions. Our second sponsor is DataSelf. DataSelf Analytics is a revolutionary reporting solution that enables organizations to make the most informed decisions faster and easier than ever. It uniquely simplifies business intelligence, empowers anyone to build and access dashboards, and delivers critical business insight when and where you need it. Our third sponsor is 24/7 Digitize. 24/7 Digitize is an Acumatica bookkeeping service provider that helps derive the best value from your Acumatica investment by maintaining your books utilizing Acumatica's best practices and guidelines. Please take a minute to support this podcast by clicking each one of the sponsor banners located at augforums.com/sponsors. Our sponsors track clicks, and every click helps to support this podcast. The second thing I'd like to mention is that I'm always looking for victims. I mean guests. If you use Acumatica in any capacity, no matter how small, I'd love to talk with you. Check out augforums.com/podcast and click the link near the top of the page to learn more about being a guest on the podcast. Third and finally, I'd love to see you listed on my Rolodex. Check out augforums.com/Rolodex to find out who else is using Acumatica and read the instructions at the top to see how you can add yourself to the list. All right, that's it for the pre-recorded intro. Let's get started. Today is Wednesday, August 31st, 2022, and this is episode number 95, Jon Flinn, using Power Query with ERP systems. Hey, Jon, thanks for coming on today.
Tim, how are you?
Doing good. Well, we're going to have to talk about the basketball connection, but maybe before we get there, you could give us your brief origin story. Where'd you grow up? Where'd you go to school? And, what have you done in your career so far?
Yeah, so from Southern California, Tim and I go way back. Went to high school together, played high school basketball together, a lot of good times there. But I went to Arizona State University. And I'm still in Arizona. I've been out here for 20 years, actually. So I did my undergrad in finance. And then I have an MBA from Arizona State as well with an emphasis in financing. So spent all my career in corporate finance, mainly focused in FP&A, financial planning and analysis. But over the past probably 5 to 8 years or something, my career is turned more towards the technology side of things. I've always had kind of an affinity for technology and how things work, and I've always tried to automate stuff. Even when I was a financial analyst starting out in my career, I always approached things the same way, where I would just try to automate all my recurring tasks. So I had more time to either surf the internet or work on ad hoc projects. So I would always, just try, how can I automate the recurring stuff? Because I hated doing stuff like, what if I want to go on vacation, or what if I'm busy doing something else? I don't want to have to send out an email every morning or every week. I want to automate all that type of stuff. And so early on, that was always a goal of mine. And the tools have gotten a lot better, since I started my career, not quite 20 years ago, but approaching 20 years ago. The tools were a lot less user-friendly. Everything now is going over to the low-code stuff where you don't have to have a formal background in development, and they're still really powerful tools. And so there's a lot of stuff I do there. Currently, I work for a global software company. It's based here in Arizona, but it's a global company, a little over $1 billion a year in revenue. I'm the head of finance technology and the chief of staff, the CFO. So I do a lot of different things there. I created an intelligent automation program at the company, my team builds custom solutions to automate stuff. We use Power Query, Microsoft Power Platform tools all day long, but we also use robotic process automation technology, and there's other custom stuff we build out in our Workday financials ERP system. So I manage the financial systems and also kind of generally manage the global finance operation for the company. So yeah, a lot of.
And even though you're working with big systems, Workday is kind of tier one, Acumatica is like mid-market. I still think a lot of the stuff that you do with Power Query is totally applicable to Acumatica, which is why we're talking about it. And so before we get into that stuff, we got to go back to high school for a moment here, talk basketball a little bit. You and I played basketball in high school. You were probably the most fun to go up against in practice because you show absolutely no mercy. And I loved going at it with you in practice. That was great. You have any memory to share about that?
I do. So I was basketball was my thing in high school. I played all 4 years and was captain of the basketball team. And really early on in my life, that was a big thing for me. That was everything for me, basketball. And Tim, what year did you come freshman year?
Yeah, so I didn't go to junior high in Santee, but I transferred into West Hills and Santee my freshman year. Yeah.
Right. So Tim was kind of new because we had all been playing since whatever, 5th, 6th grade, junior high, and I knew a lot of the guys already in our town. And Tim was new and he was quiet, but he was good and he was tough. Tim wasn't the most talented player, but he was a hard worker. And he was just tough. It's a tough defense, and he didn't give up. And I liked that. I always liked those guys. And I was, for whatever reason, at that young age, I was always testing other young men's resolve and fortitude. And, I remember one time very early on, you were playing on a basket, and I'm like, let's go. Let me see if I can break the new guy. And we would just go at it, and some good times. And I don't think I quite broke you, but I think there was a mutual respect, and I think we become friends after that, and we stayed in touch over the years and everything. But yeah, good memories.
Yeah, I always love that about Jon Flinn, hard worker and tell it like it is guy as well. I'm gonna flip it around on you and talk academics. So like in high school, I think it was 1 AP class sophomore year, 2 junior year, and then 5 AP classes my senior year. How many AP classes did you take? Remind me.
I barely graduated high school.
But then
I nearly got kicked out. I had 40-something referrals. At the very end of my senior year, they said, one more infraction, we're going to kick you out of high school. I would commonly get teachers wouldn't have me in class, and I'd have to go sit in my coach's class. Like I remember one senior year English, she just goes, "You can't come back to class like for the rest of the year." And they worked something out where I just sat in my coach's class, and he taught like some remedial something rather, and I just was like, I guess, coach, I'm the teacher's assistant. I think I had a 2.3 GPA. Wasn't really gonna go to college. College isn't something that people do in my family, and it's just, in my generation, there's 12 grandkids, and I'm the only person that went to college, ended up going to college and graduating. So with several generations, nobody, I mean, my family, they're just working class. But anyways, I got in some trouble with the law in my late teens, and got arrested a few times, and always knew that, like, well, like, you're smart enough, like, just apply yourself. And so it took me moving to Arizona and sort of just getting focused. And I graduated 3.6 GPA, and did really good in school, and some really, really tough, like, finance classes that people would fail out of. Finance was one of the programs in the business college where people would, like, they would go, you need to pick a new major if you can't get past this class. And people were dropping all the time. They were doing management and marketing and the other disciplines within finance, within business, because finance was so difficult. And I was like, I'm not dropping that teacher because of stuff. I'm not switching majors. This is what I'm going to do. And did well. And then, a couple of years after, I'm like, well, I'm going to get my MBA. And, it's worked out for me ever since. It was a good investment.
The reason I got to turn it around on you is, I took more than your 0 AP classes in high school, and you guys would always give me a hard time for being like a smart guy. But I didn't really know the plays on the basketball team very well. So there's different areas of smart, but then, I look at your career trajectory, and you've been way more successful than I have. And I know you made an observation one time at dinner that, it's not so much about, like, the academic side, right? When it comes to business, it's about working hard, and you totally do that. And I got tons of respect for you. And I think it's interesting to just see how people turn out. It's not, it's not all about academics at all. And when it comes to success in business, and I think you're proof of that.
Yeah, there's different types. Everybody's different, and there's different types of being smart, and different avenues for people. I had different starting points. My mom didn't care if I went to school, like, from an early age. I was raised just by my mom. She didn't care. You don't have to go to school if you don't want. So I would just skip school all the time, and it just wasn't something that was in, like, our family culture. And the other thing is that, like, there's people that are book smart and that can follow directions and do school, but there's also the other aspect of just the hard work, the socialization piece of it. And I think too often people dismiss students or young people, could be men or women, that maybe don't do well and with a certain structured way to learn, and they can't follow directions because they're thinking about other things. But I think that's starting to change. I think there's a lot more career paths for people that are creative, or that don't want to just, operate in that sort of box that I think we've operated in for so long. So for me, it was just, I just had to find my path, and a lot of people are this way. You just find something that you're good at, and kind of double down on that. And it took me a long time. I was a little late, and had some bumps and bruises along the way, but whatever, it's okay.
I want to apply that to Power Query, but before I do, we gotta give a shout out to, you mentioned Coach already. You got kicked out of some classes and landed in his classes, but then he was also a big presence on the basketball court. That's Coach Armstrong, Jeff Armstrong, who I think he started coaching our sophomore year. Does that sound right?
Correct.
When we were in high school?
Yeah.
And then he passed away. I don't even remember the year now, but just a few years ago, suddenly, from a heart attack. And he coached all that time, right? And I always one thing that impressed me about his philosophy is it wasn't all about winning. He really valued, like, how you were doing in school, and he took care of a lot of people. I think you were one of them. Anything you want to share about Coach Armstrong?
Oh yeah, I mean, Coach Armstrong was a special guy. For me in particular, he, I didn't have much I didn't have much stuff going on at home, and coach, I think, provided a lot of that for me, a lot of the discipline. He was very stern, and he demanded a high level of just the way that you conducted yourself. He wanted you to do good in school and stuff like that. You know, I didn't always get there on certain things in certain areas, but he pushed me, and you know, I had him at my wedding, and I you know, just been there. And then sadly he passed away, but yeah, he was a big influence on my life, and I think those types of figures are important, and they come in the form of teachers or coaches or mentors you get along the way. But he was a real special one, and one of the things that sort of resonates with me and sticks with me is that he talked about this concept of I think it was in the analogy of like a squirrel that gathers nuts. And it's like, if you look at that from like a knowledge or skill standpoint, you're sort of just incrementally adding things. And the older I get and the farther along in my career, the more that I think that super relevant regarding lots of different areas, in that everything doesn't have to be perfect, and it doesn't have to be perfect from the get-go. It's all about incrementally sort of improving things. And so if you can take small wins and how fast can we get that? Oh yeah, let's incorporate that functionality or that new report or whatever it is, that new process change. Let's do that now in the interim, and then maybe there'll be a big bang 6, 8, 10, 12, whatever months down the road. But let's keep gathering, keep learning, and keep incrementally improving. So I try to get my team to do that, and I try to approach things that way, even when, you know, I'll, like a couple examples, like we'll want to build an automation, and a lot of times it could be in Power Query, and they're like, we get from the business, no, a new system's coming in, and that's going to fix everything. Oh, okay. Have we selected the new system? Do we have done the architecture? Do we have requirements? Oh, well, no. Oh, okay. Well, then I would say we don't have any plans for that. You know, and sometimes it's farther along with that. We're like, well, we have a tool and we're trying to implement it. I'm like, okay, when are you going to implement? Okay. Do you know this specific functionality is going to be in there? Okay, well, let me do the math on it, and let me pad that a little bit, because implementations, big ones, usually run over, and they're usually not as expected. And so I really double down on those and really double click and say, like, but really, is that going to get done? And then a lot of times I can make a case for an interim solution to get something in place. Because again, it's like, how can we get, it's like speed kills, you know, speed. How can you get stuff done quickly, get it into production, even if it's an incremental increase in productivity or accuracy or whatever it is. And that's something I think early on, I think Armstrong was sort of like, you know, we learned a little bit on that game. We learned a little bit here and there. Let's build on that. You know, we had a rough outing here. The team stomped us, you know, whatever. They killed us in the paint. They beat us up. They were bigger, stronger, tougher. Well, let's get bigger, stronger, tougher. Let's get tougher at least. We might not be able to get bigger, stronger, but we can get tougher mentally. And so you sort of take that to your next challenge.
Yeah, so you've got this continuous improvement mindset. And in addition to that, I was also curious your thoughts on like applying it to Power Query. I feel like, so we're both from East County, San Diego. We didn't grow up in La Jolla. I didn't even know what passive income was like until college. I learned about that in school. There's no like passive element, right? It's like you got to get up every day and put in the work. And I feel like that kind of attitude lends itself well to Power Query. What are your thoughts on that? Because it's sort of like this tool that's just there, right? But you got to learn it, but it's an accessible tool. There's no barrier to entry with it, you know, kind of like the La Jolla versus East County, San Diego example. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, like, you know, people always ask, oh my gosh, do we have to get a new license or whatever? Like, no, this has been in Excel since, I think it was released in 2010 as an Excel add-in, and then shortly after it got integrated into just the regular release of Excel. So it's available, and it's pretty easy to use. And particularly around, there's kind of a couple areas I think where it's it really shines. One of them is connecting directly into data sources. So it's got this Power Query engine has a lot of connectors, and you can connect into things, and it's essentially the same engine that sits in Power BI too, which is Microsoft's visualization dashboarding tool. It's the same backend, same sort of engine. Some of the underlying technology, I think, is a little bit different. Power BI seems to work a little more efficient in some of the bigger query folding and calculations and stuff like that. But essentially, from a user interface standpoint, it's the same. So you can connect into anything. So, you're sort of limited by where you're connecting into. Some systems have limitations and don't allow the Microsoft connectors to get in there, but a lot of them do. And then also just the data transformation piece. That's kind of the ETL, extract, transform, load, data step. So, if you're taking a report out of your system, which most people do, and even with Workday, these ERP systems, they've gotten so much better over the years, and I'm a big fan of Workday. I like them. I'm a speaker at their user conference in Florida in 2 weeks, and so I'm always doing stuff with them, and I like the functionality they have, very flexible, but they can't do everything. Business is so complex nowadays, and there's so many different aspects to the accounting, to the rev rec, to non-standard contracts and billing schedules, and there's just so much that you rarely find an ERP system that just hits a home run in every single little area. And so what you're left with is a bunch of accounting folks taking data out of the system, doing some sort of calculation and manipulation to get to an output that they need to do their job. Sometimes they put that back in the system, or maybe they put it in another system, or maybe it's, just for reporting purposes, but that's generally how it goes. And a lot of that's done, the vast majority of it is just done in Excel, and it's just done in the old clunky, well, I filter and then I delete these rows and then I do a pivot table and then I copy that pivot table over here, and it's very clunky. You can automate all those steps. And we've had tremendous amount of success in automating processes that are super complex with Power Query that connect into multiple different data sources, building out like a big data model, allowing input for people to toggle dates and put in different parameters, and then just get sort of real-time views of things at sort of a kind of a push of a button once you sort of code it in. So we've had a tremendous amount of success using it.
And you started using Power Query like back in more of a financial planning and analysis role. Was that right?
Yeah, so I was working for a media company before this software company. So this was probably 6 years ago or something, 6-7 years ago. And I had a guy on my team that was an analyst, and he started working with it, and he showed me, hey, we got this functionality, and then I started jumping in. And so we were using it for reporting purposes, but then we started automating like accounting stuff. Our accounting group had some complicated things. I'm like, oh, well, let me just, so you're tying two data sets together, and you're, want to generate some variances and do some matching and stuff like that. Oh, let me take a stab at it. So I started, doing that. Also building forecast models. Like when I started with the software company, that was the big need. I was supporting the SaaS business, which was growing really fast, and they needed tools. They had the guys that were in place doing the job just didn't have the technical skills or kind of the vision for like, how do you automate something and how do you standardize things? And, first thing I did was push whatever I could to the systems, meaning if there's fields available to track in our existing systems, let's do it that way, not track offline in spreadsheets. So let's try to get out of spreadsheets as much as we can, and for like the kind of the core data of like, what is the status of this, or what is the date this deal is going to be closed or this renewal is going to be closed. There's fields for that in the system. It's a matter of driving the discipline and getting leadership behind and stuff like that. So move stuff into the system, and then inserted some pretty complex Power Query models to take it out from multiple different systems, allow input, and then to spit out a forecast, like a revenue expense forecast, that we could, easily take leadership through. So I've done a lot of use cases on the, financial planning side.
You mentioned inputs. Would the inputs just go into an Excel sheet and then get used by the model, or is there some more sophisticated way of doing that?
No, there's lots of different ways. So one of the other things I did start doing consulting recently on the side, which is kind of a new venture for me, which I'm excited about. I got my first client, which is about a $10 million a year construction company in Arizona. And their first project was actually a Power Query forecast model. And there's really two main ways to do input in Excel for Power Query. You can do what is called parameters, but that requires you to go into the Power Query editor, which is easy. You just click into it, but it's sort of on the back end of Excel, and you can enter in pieces of information. Those are good for like individual data points. Like you want to input the start date or start period for a forecast is one of them. I've just found that users would prefer a Excel table input. And so,
yeah, me too.
So that's essentially what I do. So like in that one example for a forecast, period start, because everything sort of flows, like I'll pull in all these actual data, I want to cut it off at a certain point, and then I want to start the forecasting logic from one period, but I want that as an input. I want them to be able to tell me when the forecast period is. And so I just set that up as a singular, Excel table with one row. And then you can update it, and then the model is set to pull that in. And then in Power Query, you can basically distill that down to a single value, and then you can reference it in all your logic. So like all my filters and all my queries in Power Query, I reference that input.
And then your forecasting, is that all done in Power Query, or are you then feeding the Power Query data sets into the Power Pivot data model and doing, like, what's the output look like? Is it a pivot table, or how does that part work?
Pivot table, it goes into the data model. And so for those of you who aren't familiar with kind of the setup in the Microsoft Excel, there's kind of a couple different areas of functionality. There's this underlying engine of Power Query, which really is the engine for connecting into data and transforming the data. So by transforming, I mean you can add columns, you can create custom columns, you can build in logic. It's basically like a data table, and you can delete rows, delete columns, you can group things, summarize things, you can add calculated columns, all these sorts of things. So lots of different powerful ways to transform the data there. Now, when you output it from there, you can output it several different ways. You can throw it directly into a flat table in Excel, which is just a flat data table if you want that. In some use cases, maybe that's the way you want it. But generally, you pull it into the data model, and it's kind of easy. You just right-click on the query, you load to, and you select the data model, which is kind of another area of functionality, which in Excel's got this really powerful compression engine, meaning it's really efficient to build as much logic as you can in the data model, because the compression engine there is really great, and Excel just seems to operate a lot better in a lot of cases than adding all the logic in Power Query. Now, Power Query, I find it's kind of easier to work with in some ways, but essentially, generally speaking, you get it over the data model, and then you start building your measures or kind of calculations in the data model. And then also in the data model, you can create relationships. You build out your sort of star schema, traditional kind of data modeling, relational database. And so there's a visual view, and you start, instead of smushing all the tables together, I can keep like my dimension table separate from my fact table. And then if I have a key, I sort of tie them together. And then the output comes in the form of a pivot table. But it does get very specific on like what type of measures and visualizations whether or not you should build out things in Power Query or the data model. It's always one of those things that I get into it and I'm like, okay, should I add? Because you can add custom columns, all sorts of stuff in the data model. It really just depends on what you're trying to, what the end product is. But in this latest use case I have, it's a pivot table, which is fine, and you can add slicers and it'll refresh automatically when the whole file refreshes, so it works well for the output.
And to your point earlier about incremental improvements, so like, sometimes you feel like you put too much logic in Power Query and you end up putting more in the data model, or vice versa, and it's not really a big deal. It's not like you went down a path and there's no going back because of the nature of the tools. You can change the way you're doing it once you get further down the road, right?
Happens all the time. Sometimes you don't know what the end is. Like I sort of know, like even when I took on this consulting project, I'm like, oh shit, I better execute on this one.
Yeah, this is your first one. There might not be a second one, right?
I know, like it's only up to me, and so, I looked at everything and I thought, like, yeah, I've done ones that are complex like this. And when I got into it, every project presents its own unique challenges. And to me, I just approach it like, well, okay, so you try to be thoughtful and solve it the best way, but just solve it first. Just solve it, get the output that you want. And then the big consideration is performance. And really that manifests itself in refresh time. And so if there isn't a performance issue, and it's, then don't make an issue out of it. And then it's not a problem, right? And so you particularly get into issues. What I found in Power Query with performance is when you do a lot of query merges in Power Query. So there's a functionality where you can basically merge columns. You tie the columns together and you start bringing data in and merging different.
It's sort of like a VLOOKUP, right? It's like a more
sort of like a VLOOKUP.
Yeah,
exactly,
okay.
Exactly. And so the other options for that, and it's easy to do, and sometimes Power Query is super easy to work with. It's like, I'm just gonna merge. It'll be okay. But if you do too many, it's too much. And so the alternatives are you can actually do a lookup with the lookup value function in the data model, which literally is almost the same as a VLOOKUP. You just need that value. You can do that in the data model, or you can draw the relationships between the tables. And when you visualize it or throw it in a pivot table, it essentially allows you to pull in the related columns based on the relationship. But again, it depends on what other logic is built off of that. And excuse me, if that merge and lookup isn't done in Power Query, if there's additional logic you need to build on that's derived off of that lookup, you're pigeonholed into doing the data model, which is sort of after the fact, if you decide to do it in the data model. So there's just all these considerations on how you should approach it. But honestly, if the refresh isn't taking forever, it's probably fine. But I have found there's several times where I'm like, oh man, I'm going to rebuild it. And sometimes we start over. Sometimes like I'm going to take a whole different approach. And it's kind of fun too. It's kind of a complex puzzle that you have to solve. And then you're like, oh, I moved all the logic into the data model. It just hums now. It's a 45-second refresh instead of 15 minutes. So yeah, it just sort of depends.
I lost my internet for a second there, but the recording's in the cloud, so it should be okay.
Okay.
Yeah, so the VLOOKUP part, the performance part, I like the point you made too about, look, if the refresh is not taking too long, don't worry about it, right? I mean, you could be a data nerd and like get out your, I can make it go 5 seconds faster, but who cares if it takes 2 minutes and 2 minutes is not a big deal to me. Great. It got the job done and move on to the next project, right? It's good at getting
100%.
Stuff done.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, it's like, there's certain things that best practice here and there, and you're like, okay, should probably do it that way. In this one, I'm like, okay, I should solve in the data model, and I started looking at it. I'm like, oh, geez, this is 15 hours of work just to probably build this logic out, or I could spend, a quarter of that time and build it out in Power Query. So I'm like, I'm just going to build it out, and we'll check the performance at the end. If there's any problems, I'll go back and redo it, and there, it was fine. The other thing I'll mention is, like I said, the Power Query functionality in the queries actually are the same as Power BI. So if you guys, your organization's using Power BI as the data visualization and dashboarding tool, you can actually copy and paste the queries directly into Power BI, and it works just the same. So I do that a lot of times where, because I'm so familiar and so good in Excel, sometimes I just prefer the user interface, and I like how I can throw it into Excel in a table and check and do my testing, and throw it in a pivot table. Oh, okay, yeah, it looks good. A lot of times I'll just do that, and then you literally right-click, copy, and open up the desktop Power BI version, and you just paste in the queries. And all the logic's there, everything's there, and then you can build your visualizations in Power BI. So that, I don't know if people know that a lot. Like that's an option.
Are you actually using the powerbi.com at your current place, even though you're on Workday? Oh, really?
Yeah. Oh,
interesting.
Yeah.
How do you deploy it? Like how do people run the reports? They just run it on powerbi.com, or do you somehow embed it in Workday, or how does that work?
For Workday reporting?
No, for the Power BI part of it. It's like if you're using powerbi.com to actually deploy dashboards,
yeah,
how do people use it? Just on powerbi.com?
Yeah. So if you're talking about specifically Workday data, there's a couple different ways, and their reporting isn't great. And I'm actually working with their product team, and they're going to make some changes on reporting for Workday. I met with them 2 weeks ago and kind of gave them some feedback and stuff. So great team to work with, and I know they're working on some changes there. But currently, the majority of people just run reports in the user interface and download them to their desktop, and that's how they get data out of Workday. They do have a RAS service, like a web service, where you can connect into reports, like report as a service. And so we can connect into those from Power BI, which is great. So we do that a lot, and so we'll leverage the Power BI service on powerbi.com, where you can schedule the refreshes, and it'll go into Workday, and it'll call that report, and it'll bring in the data, and you can do your visualizations and stuff like that. So we do that for Workday data. We have other data. We have a Azure data platform, like Azure Data Lake and Databricks and all that type of stuff. And so we have Salesforce.com. So wherever our data is at, for the most part, we can connect into data sets, and then just the cool thing is in Power BI, you can schedule the refreshes. Right, so that's another consideration. If my refresh time is 30 minutes for my queries, and I know ultimately I'm going to put them in Power BI, I don't care, because I'm going to schedule the refresh, and I'll schedule it at 1 a.m. And it doesn't matter if it takes 45 minutes. When the refresh is done, the updated data will display. So when people come in, you have access to it. The data is there for you, and it could refresh maybe every morning. I mean, you could refresh every 30 minutes if you want with the Power BI service. But if your refresh time is more than 30 minutes, probably not a good idea.
I want to come back to Power Query because I feel like it's the gateway drug into all of this. But we talked about Power Query in Excel. Then you can go into the data model, which used to be called Power Pivot in Excel. Right. Both those things together are essentially Power BI. Then you can go on to powerbi.com, do visuals. Yeah. I'm curious, since you got the FP&A background, there's a tool, I can't remember if I've ever asked you about. Have you ever looked at the Power Planning tool that sits on top of Power BI visuals?
No.
I'll send you a link. I'll include a link on this episode too. I'll send it to you. I'm curious. It basically allows Writeback, because like in the FP&A situation, sometimes you need to write back the data, right?
Yeah.
You might be using like what's Workday's? It's starts with an A. They acquired adaptive planning. Yeah. Do you guys use that?
No, we don't have that. We have an Oracle EPBCS, like cloud planning tool. Used to be called Hyperion, the on-prem version
Oh, okay.
of it. But so the Writeback capability, so I didn't know it's called Power Planning. That there might be some additional functionality in there, but I am familiar with the Writeback functionality. We have a couple use cases there, and the underlying sort of mechanism there is Power Apps, which is you can build apps, which I built apps in Power Apps, and then they have the Power Automate, which used to be called Flow, Microsoft Flow, which allows you to automate sort of different workflows. It's also got like some RPA functionality, robotic process automation functionality in there. But the Writeback stuff we're doing is essentially, my understanding is it's like embedding a Power App, which is basically a Microsoft templated web app in Power BI that can take input and sort of feed them back into the data set and then update visuals like, almost real time. And so we're just starting a couple use cases where, we need Writeback capability done through kind of Power Automate, Power Apps, and Power BI.
Gotcha. So yeah, Power Apps is like the native Writeback. I'll send you like a demo video on that. Yeah, it's like just some additional bells and whistles for Writeback. So we kind of went all the way from like the duct tape tool all the way up to the fancier end of things. But I'm bringing it back to Power Query. I think it's interesting that you're now in more of an IT role, whereas to me, like, this is my take on it. Tell me if you agree. Like, financial planning and analysis can get a little ivory tower, where like you're doing all this analysis and you're maybe a publicly traded company, and so your audience is really the investors or the market, and you can get kind of disconnected from the actual processes that happen in the organization. Do you feel like coming back into more the IT side of things, is that because you like fixing processes and helping the analysis with better data? Or like, what made you kind of come back into the IT side of things, and how much did Power Query play a role in that?
Yeah, well, I still sit in finance. I'm basically the tech guy that sits in finance. And, I've spent my whole career in finance, so I don't report up through IT, but my focus certainly is technology. And I guess the reason I fell into that, for one, I hate doing the same stuff all the time. So I don't want to do the forecast every month. I hate the recurring stuff. Oh, what's coming up? Oh, the forecast again? Oh, yep, here comes the forecast again. Oh, planning, budgeting again. Okay, now dust off the templates, and I like to do something different, and I like to improve things all the time. And I was, from early on, I would get in these roles and I would spend 6 months to a year automating everything in my role or on my team, and then I'd be like, okay, now what? And then I would just leave the company. I'd be like, well, you're not going to give me anything else to do. I don't want to do the same old stuff, year over year. And that's just the way I am. I don't know. And so, finally, when I landed with my current company, they sort of gave me the keys to the Porsche and said, all right, do this for all of finance. We're in, 13 different countries and over 200 people. And they're like, well, we want you to automate everything for everybody, And so I created this formal program and built out my team. I started just by myself. I started the finance transformation as one person. Now I have 10 people on my team, and we've moved up to big system implementations and built all these custom things. But it was really just like I have just a motor that I just want to keep going, and automate stuff. And I just had an affinity for the technology piece and the analysis, but I love the financial analysis stuff. And I still get pulled into stuff where they're like, we had an error in our reporting that went externally, and we need all hands on deck. We need you to drop everything and jump in because, we're doing this, we're doing that. Like we were going to go public last year, and we had an issue with the S1 filing, and nobody could figure it out, and so they gave it to me. It's not my job, but I was able to jump in, and I used Power Query on that to connect into all the data. And it was one of those things like daily calls, like, multiple times a day over the weekend with the CFO and with everybody to like, hey, here's what the issue is. I've quantified it. I've located exactly what it is. I've also found this and that, and I've also found this. I don't think we knew about this. I didn't think we knew about this logic. And that was all through Power Query. So it's just a powerful tool, and I've trained lots of people on it. I did a training in my company that had 100 people that did Power Query. It was a Power Query specific training. We had like 120 people attend. I don't know that it stuck with everybody. Not everybody has the same motor engine where they just want to get in and tinker with things and fix things and improve things. But there's certain power users that are killing it, that are automating stuff on their own, and now they've moved on to Power BI, and they're building dashboards. And so, there's challenges in scaling and stuff, but certainly anybody who's in FP&A, financial analyst, senior financial analyst role, if you're not using Power Query and you're using the old sort of 1998 style of analysis and data transformation in Excel, then I don't know what to do for you, because you should be the tip of the spear of these tools, and the productivity enhancements you can get from these things are incredible.
I never thought about, just because I haven't been in an FP&A role, I've always looked at it as maybe being more sophisticated than it is. I hadn't thought about the recurring nature of it. You're like, all right, let's do the forecast again.
Yeah.
Sounds a lot like, let's do the accounting close process again.
It is.
The recurring nature of it.
Yeah, it's just a little more complicated, and there is an art to it. People like to think, and forecasting, whatever, it's just, we'll use the math and stuff. I built the most complex models anyone could ever build. And then you get to an output that's like, that's not reasonable. I'm going to change it. It's because there's lots of assumptions you layer on, and there's imperfect data, and there's real world challenges that you can't quantify. And so, I think, going with speed, simplicity, and automation is a much better approach. And then, providing that mechanism to our driver to sort of tweak things, because I think there is a decent amount of art that comes into play with the finance. So certainly more of an art, much more of an art than accounting.
That makes sense. But yeah, it's still the same Power Query tool that you're able to use in both areas. And I think, maybe that's for the accountant, the lowly accountant who's doing the month-end close, lowly compared to the FP&A person. To me, that's a big incentive to get involved with Power Query, right? Automate your stuff, and you're sort of stepping into a world that could lead to a more sophisticated role down the road, right?
Huge. I'll tell you what, there's got to be so much opportunity in accounting for the people who excel at just hammering through data and understanding how to just create good processes. Power Query is a perfect way, a catalyst to get in there and do that. In other words, if you're a senior accountant out there, your ERP system, whatever it is, doesn't do everything that you need it to do, and you have to do a lot of stuff in Excel, and you can get into Power Query. And the other thing I'll say is that there is so much information out there. So if you can't learn it, I don't know what to do for you, because there's so much resources out there, YouTube videos, literally for every single use case and subject. If you don't know how to do it, you can Google it. I do it all the time. I don't even bother memorizing things anymore, because I know it's out there. And
give us a starting point. So the flip side is it can be overwhelming. Is there a particular course, a particular book, anything that you would find as like a good entry point?
I think the best way for something to stick with you is to actually be grounded in a real world use case. And so finding something where again, it's like, are you taking data? And look, don't get too caught up on, well, how do I connect into the data or whatever? If you download the report and you have it in an Excel table, you can start right there and then incrementally improve later on. If later on you can find a way to connect into the whatever system and get that data automatically, even better. But for now, just start with what you got. And if what you got is an Excel data table, perfect. You can take that into Excel. All you do is go into the data tab. You can pull that in. It'll automatically create an Excel table, put it in Power Query, and then you can start playing around with, what do I normally do? And I would say be organized. Write it down on a piece of paper. What do I do? What are my steps of my process? Maybe you have this done. Maybe you don't. You probably should have a document, but maybe you don't. I delete this column. Well, I group by whatever, the region, because I filter and I'm only looking at this subset of the data. Okay, so I filter on that. I'm deleting a column. Maybe I'm collapsing. I want to group things. Okay, so 3 major actions. And then I'm adding a calculation column because I want to calculate whatever. It's not in my report. It's a subtraction, a division, whatever the heck it is. And then I need an additional classifier that isn't in my source data. I want to group things differently because my leadership wants to see things slightly differently than we have it set up in our system. Maybe long term, I'll work with the IT team to get that built in the system. But for now, I got to do my job, and my boss wants to see this category. So I need a logical sort of custom column. So, okay, let's just say I need those 5 things done, and the output it gets me where I need to be. Okay, now you just got to figure out, how do I do that in Excel? And I'll tell you, in Power Query, look up at the top, there's buttons, and they tell you what they do. And so I think that's the easiest way. And the other thing is, on the right-hand side is the step editor. So whatever action you do, a step will pop up right on the right-hand side. And if you don't like that step or the output or what was done, you just hit delete and you can go back. And you can't break anything, so carve out some time, carve out an afternoon on a Friday where there's no meetings and no calls or whatever, and just start running through it and just try to do those 5 actions. And it could be simple, like I said, deleting, grouping, filtering, and you'll find it super easy. And a lot of it's so intuitive. Filtering, how do you think you would filter it? Well, there's a little filter, icon in the column, just like there is in Excel. You click it, and you just select, okay, and it generates the code for you, right? So people are sharp, and most of accountants and finance folks, they've been working in Excel for years. So I hope you should be familiar, right? You're familiar with filters, you're familiar with the different functionality, and this is just sort of the next step.
I love the low barrier to entry for it. Yeah, I agree. Anyone can pick it up. You just got to start. That's good advice. Just start, write down what you're doing manually, and try automating in Power Query.
Yep.
Well, hey, I got another call at the top of the hour. I know you also wanted to bring up AP automation, but maybe I could have you on again in the future for that. I don't know if we'll be able to do that justice in 2 minutes.
No, I'd love to talk about AP automation. I listened to your podcast on that. I thought it was super interesting, and I think your intuition is spot on some of the challenges. And so I did run one of those programs at the software company I'm at, and a lot of interesting findings. And not everything ends up as a home run, and this one didn't actually decommissioned it, but a lot of learnings on that. And I don't think I necessarily or the project team did anything wrong. It was just there was a bunch of factors that you sort of consider for all those folks that are considering automating the AP stuff. So I'd love to talk at length about that.
Well, John, this has been awesome. I got goosebumps a couple times. It's really cool to blend the high school basketball world with I still can't believe that we work on similar stuff. Of course, I think you're way more sophisticated than I am, and you're in a much more complex world than I am. But just to have a common ground on these Power Query and the other Power tools is really cool. Thanks for making the time and coming on today.
Yeah, it's been fun, Tim. Yeah, I'd love to come back and talk to you.
All right. Well, that's it for now. We'll catch you on the next episode of AUGforums.com Real Talk. Thanks for listening, and take care.